Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the March meeting of CSBARS. I want to welcome everyone this afternoon, both those who might be attending from the public, as well as all of the CSBARS members and State Bar staff. And as we get started, why don't we start with roll call?
Okay. Dean Clancy.
Present.
Dean Gardina.
Present.
Dean Frickberg.
Present.
Mr. Kramer.
Present.
Mr. Murphy.
Present.
Dean Park.
Present.
Dean Pritikin. Okay. All right, well, we have quorum.
Thank you, Ashley. Now is the time that we normally take public comment. So I'd like to open the floor up for public comment, normally limited to 3 minutes. So is there anyone in the public who would like to provide public comment? Okay, it doesn't appear as if there's anyone who would like to provide public comment at this time. So we can move forward with approval of the minutes. The minutes were attached to the agenda. Did everyone have an opportunity to review the minutes? Okay. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
I'll second that motion.
Thank you. Okay. Any discussion, changes? Okay. Why don't we do a roll call vote on the minutes?
Apologies, one moment. Dean Clancy.
Aye.
Dean Gardina. Dean Frickberg.
Aye.
Mr. Kramer.
Aye.
Mr. Murphy.
Aye.
Dean Park.
Aye.
Dean Pritikin.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Okay. And I believe next on the agenda is the staff report.
Yes. Hi. So the staff report today is really focused on the progress of the proposed revised accredited law school rules. So they were posted for public comment through February 15 on our public comment website. We received a total of 5 comments, and as standard practice, they will actually be sent back to the committee to review that comment as the originating recommender to the board. And the committee will be reviewing them to see if any changes are needed as a result, or if not, we'll be recommending that they be approved as posted. So the committee will be doing that at their meeting on Friday. And in the meantime, the next topic here at CSBARS will be to continue the feedback from CSBARS on guidelines before staff begins to draft a proposed guideline set. Thank you. So that is our staff report.
And Natalie, just for purposes of understanding timeline, various meetings, so know that we've got the CBE meeting this Friday, at which point a recommendation appears to be made and changes or not changes. The next Board of Trustees meeting would be May, where they would have time to take that up, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And as a result, oh, please go ahead.
No, I'm trying to, so as we're figuring out the guideline timeline, the earliest that the Board of Trustees might make something kind of approved, assuming there's no changes and it goes up to the Board of Trustees in May, what would be the soonest potentially that they would be approved?
Well, that's we can talk about that after we get a little bit more feedback from the CBE. There'll be a little bit of a period of an on-ramp of probably about 6 months or so. That's sort of the general time frame that was discussed before. And then also a phase-in period is going to be proposed to the Board of Trustees as it was before.
So in terms of just finalizing the guidelines, we have several months try to get those guidelines in place before the rules become a permanent part of the landscape.
In total, but to offer plenty of time for public comment, that's why we are hoping to receive all of CSBARS feedback through last meeting as well as this meeting, and then also having a further opportunity to comment on a written guideline set.
Okay, thank you for that. And just as a reminder, we do have a meeting in April as well. April 7th, I believe, is the date of that meeting. Okay. All right.
I
So
believe it will be.
I don't think
the
that's
20
the, yeah, go ahead. Now.
Oh, it will be the 21st.
the
Also a Wednesday, also a webinar, 1 to 3.
I don't know why I had the 7th on my calendar. Okay. Thank you.
Jackie,
Yes.
when the roll call was called, Dean Pritikin wasn't present, but he was there within seconds after that. I just thought who's ever taken the minutes should note that he's been present for the meeting.
Thank you for that, Greg.
Thanks.
Okay. So no other recent developments, Natalie, that the staff want to share?
Not at this time. Amy or Audrey, any others to share?
Not at this time. And we'll probably have a lot more at the April meeting. Excuse me.
Well, I know that we are hoping to have the COAF members here to move forward on a discussion regarding the diversity, equity, and inclusion portion of the rules. Because they haven't been able to join us yet, and I believe they're joining us around 1:30, we have an opportunity to both just remind ourselves where we are with the guidelines, as well as perhaps talk about some guidelines other than the DEI portion of it while we wait for them. And they're coming, as we were reminded, really to answer any questions we might have about how the work that they're doing intersects with the work that we're doing, both in the rules at our schools, and then how that might inform any guidelines that we might want to create regarding those portions of the guidelines. So just as a reminder of where we are, back in January, we had the opportunity to take the rules that are still in their proposed stage, so not finalized rules, and the deans reviewed them with an eye towards implementation at their schools to see whether there was any ambiguity or anything that needed to be clarified. Again, we worked very hard to create the rules in a way in which we wouldn't need a lot of additional regulation. And at least at first review by the deans, the number of regulations that would be necessary at this point was very few. And at the last meeting, we actually had the opportunity to look at a proposed guideline under 4.160A related to the location of the school and some clarification regarding both, I think, remote work, which, as we all know, is now ubiquitous and probably will become a part of our landscape as a general matter, as well as software or servers or other things that might be located outside the state of California. We also had a chance to look at and discuss the social media complexities of 4.60A5 or excuse me, 6, which related to our need to, every time we say accredited or provisionally accredited, we had to have more information located in relation to that. And certain social media sites obviously place limits around that. So was there a way for us to craft a particular guideline that allowed for an exception when those social media sites were being used, such as a hyperlink to where that information would be contained? So we were able to speak to that as it relates to the guidelines, and 2 guidelines were proposed. They're very similar to each other, really with the same outcome. And when we get to the point where we're going to to finally vote on or recommend some measures to the CBE, we can choose between those or blend them together in some meaningful way. We then had the opportunity, or we didn't quite get to the piece regarding maintaining accurate and complete records, which is number 11 in section 4.160A. And the concerns raised in this was the length of time, especially if we're talking 10 to 14 years as it relates to those who are going to be subject to inspection, and whether or not the annual report served the same purpose. And so was there a way to kind of create clarity around what records need to be maintained, and whether or not the annual report or other documents serve the same purpose as quote unquote kind of all the records. So Marty, I believe it was you who created, or at least raised this in your read of the rules, as maybe it's something that we could speak to with a little bit more clarity and cabin it a little bit. So I don't know whether you want to speak to that directly now.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it last time. My suggestion was we should figure out what are the subcategories of documents that the state bar is going to want on a long-term basis, right? There's certain things like student records, obviously we have to keep forever now anyway, right? Require those for a long period of time. Other than that, the only categories would be things that were raised in prior, report backs, right? I don't really have anything more to add to that. I mean, I would really defer to the state bar as to what particular categories of documents they feel they need to have on a long-term basis from all schools, regardless of what was in the report back letter. But conceptually, that's what I think would make sense.
Other comments related to the maintenance of the records, which is number 11.
I'll just make a comment that might be helpful to note. Part of what the state bar is doing internally is over the past year, due to the pandemic situation, we've been doing remote inspections. And so we're learning what it means for us to meet with the schools remotely, also for the schools to be able to share their documents as they're stored in electronic form. And so we are thinking about those things, about the ways that you are already storing your things and how your materials and records and how they may be stored in the future, to make something practical for you to share as well.
And so I think that the portion of the sentence or the phrase is sufficient records to demonstrate its compliance from its last 2 periodic inspections to present. So just you guys are getting a sense of what sufficient records means to you.
Yes, and if it's and how something can be reasonably stored and accessed. So you might, for example, be receiving some information regarding suggested document retention timelines and things like that.
And Natalie, is that something that you think by April you could share in terms of what the State Bar has learned as they've gone through these inspections about what they find most helpful in terms of the records that they want to have available and the storage for it?
We definitely can give an update about what the inspections have been like at that time. The particular rules will not be adopted, so it would be premature to have a final sort of list, but an update's reasonable.
Yeah, I think it would help craft the guideline because we'll have a sense of what it is that the State Bar is looking for. And so perhaps we could craft a guideline that's consistent with what the needs are.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jay?
Just one other area, if I can give a little more detail, I think is a good example. There's the requirement of having official transcripts. I think we would all agree that electronic records are far superior. They can be duplicated, they can be secured, but there's still a requirement for official transcript, which in most cases will be a paper document. There could be a carve out where the school affirms they received an official transcript, but then only retains the digital copy of that official transcript. I think that'd be preferable for everybody.
And just as a matter of straw poll, just amongst the deans that are here at CSBARS, do you use the LSDAS transcript service, or do you work directly with the transcripts from the schools? So it's sort of maybe just Zoom raise your hand if you use LSDAS as one option at your school.
For those students who take the LSAT, but not all do.
Right.
Okay, so it looks like 3 consider and 2 do not, and no school is required to. Okay, thank you.
Other thoughts or comments about this, either experience at your institutions or questions about what it is that you'd be required to maintain for that potentially 14 years?
Just going back to the document, I think the language about 2 inspections worth of data, where it's especially addressing records relevant to addressing any areas of non-compliance, I think that specificity fits with what would be needed for those inspection cycles. And then what it says otherwise is all other data would be for a period of 3 years suggested. So I'm assuming these exist outside of what needs to be permanent records. And I think that's what it says there as well. And I think that's a good overall framework, definitely, to begin the discussion.
Okay, so to you, the proposed guideline provides sufficient parameters at this point to move it forward, wordsmithing as we will when we come closer to presenting it for a recommendation.
Yeah, I think if the beginning framework is it's clear what records should stay permanent, what records should stay permanent versus how long to keep onto records that are relevant to address areas of non-compliance, and then other data. I think that looks like a sufficient beginning framework to craft a helpful guideline.
Okay, all right, thank you. Other thoughts? Okay. All right, so I've made some notes there. Natalie, coming back in April with any additional thoughts about what the State Bar has learned that might help us fill in some specificity but still leaving it room for growth as we figure this out as we move along, I think would be helpful. Okay, so next up, was the admissions criteria. It has been a source of conversation even when we were crafting the rules. Somebody identified that idea of the reasonable prospect of completing the degree or meeting the program objectives based on the information reasonably available to the law school at the time of admission, and queried whether or not we needed some clarification about reasonably available to the law school at the time of admission. So welcome thoughts about the admissions criteria.
I'll take a moment to say that I'll recognize the silence as an example of how hard this committee worked in putting together guidelines that might be clear up front, and should feel good about that.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. This is, I think, for me, and I welcoming COAF's engagement in this. I think the admissions criteria and that idea of opening the pipeline to the profession are intertwined, and I will be interested to hear the discussion that we'll be able to have with COAF and weaving our admissions policies with our academic support and academic services and our work on that equity and inclusion idea as we move towards a more diverse, or hopefully move towards a more diverse legal profession. That I don't know that you can separate out admissions, academic services, and academic success as two distinct concepts. It seems like they're part of a line in terms of that idea of diversifying the legal profession. So it's certainly something that I think we could talk about as it relates to the DEI initiatives as well. So any thoughts about that at this point before COAF joins us?
I just wanted to double check, and I'm sorry I'm on mute. In the OneDrive folder, just where is the proposed guideline for admissions criteria?
There isn't one. So if you look at the document, it just says possible clarification as definition. So the person who reviewed this identified that as still one of those things, like what does that mean, but didn't necessarily offer a guideline, because I think it is difficult to kind of clarify what do we mean by that.
Thank you. Just wanted to be sure.
And Dean Gardina, you mentioned several elements that intertwine with admissions, and another that I've heard mentioned in this group and elsewhere might also be the communications aspect when reaching out to students, how to correctly describe the opportunities, the requirements, and the services that will be available at the school. Having that student have that clarity before they make their decision may play into this as well.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm trying to track down. It doesn't look like in that OneDrive that we have the actual.
So I believe that Natalie sent around a document to all of you, and in that document from Natalie is both the rules and the proposed guidelines. And you'll notice under 6 admissions, it just says issue and then identifies that language as potentially needing clarification.
Dean Gardina, would you like us to put that file up as a reference?
We can certainly do that, sure.
If you'd like to, we absolutely can. I'll ask Ashley if she can bring up the Word file that has the proposed suggestions or proposed guidelines in the sort of brown color.
Got it. Thank you.
I just wasn't sure if you wanted to be showing them just yet, but there we can.
Sure. I think if it aids the conversation and certainly allows the public to see where we're going, or at least the conversations that we're having and following along. The one thing, Natalie, that you just noted, and I want to make sure that I understand the kind of what we really talk about in 4.160A is that kind of consumer protection and transparency piece, which would include making sure that any prospective student or applicant was properly instructed about what the school offers, what services are available, and things like that, versus admissions. Well, they're connected, but you were thinking about that more in the consumer protection and transparency category.
Yes, and also communication of just opportunity in addition with that.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure that we were on the same page about where that might go if we needed clarification on that. Okay, and so next up, and Natalie, I think you and I had a conversation was going to be, and if you want to get to this, Ashley, on it, is number 8 under 4.160B. The person who reviewed this particular provision wondered if there needed to be a statement in there about exceptions that might be made that went beyond the 3 times that someone needed to take the bar exam. And I think, Natalie, you had some clarification about this.
Sure. So I think in the present day exception that they might have been thinking about is the opportunity for the students in the June cohort of first year takers to have 4 opportunities rather than 3 to take the exam, and imagining that perhaps there might be a situation in the future. The way that the rule was adjusted, the admissions rule, it already contemplates that. And so we don't need to further enumerate it here. If there were additional situations in the future, they could be noted in the guidelines as they are currently in today's operative guidelines. Rather than, because it's something that's temporary, it could be placed in a guideline, although this particular one is solved by the language in the rule, indicating that the June try does not count toward the total of 3 for those students.
I just want to note, I may have been the commentator that added this, and this suggestion preceded the rollout of revised rules and guidelines. So I agree. If it's already covered and enumerated elsewhere, then this suggestion goes away.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right, thank you, Dean Park. If you were to scroll, Ashley, down to the next, on the next page, and I actually added this in as a conversation starter more than anything else. Many of the fixed facility schools have been going remote. I know that's certainly true for me. And I also know that many of our students have asked, once this is lifted, can I still attend remotely? Or will I have the option of attending remotely? And so I'm putting this as if there isn't a public health emergency that mandates that someone be absent or not in the room. And I can see this coming up in a number of ways. One is an ADA accommodation given the public health emergency. Another way that it comes up is I think people are going to be hypersensitive to someone who's ill. They have a cold, they're coughing a lot. And I know many of our students come to campus sick because they don't want to be absent and they want to get the content that's happening in class. And then also the opportunity when necessary because of work or family obligations to be able to be remote on certain evenings without having to be absent. So I just put this out there as a potential for fixed facility programs. And this would be in lieu of a major change for this. So just starting a conversation. I know it's a bigger conversation than this, but I wanted to put it out there as a potential. So just curious, I know that many of the people on the committee have online programs, and so this is less of an issue for them, but Jay, looking at you, what are your thoughts or your experience this semester regarding this?
Well, it's actually something we institutionally been looking at long-term. We're in the process of going forward with self-studies to do distance learning, to have both on-site and distance learning, so we can offer that option on a program basis to all of our students. My only concern in reading the orange highlighted portion would be, is it going to be on a per course? So I can, in essence, miss 4 class sessions in person, but view the recording asynchronous or watch it online synchronous. And that might be difficult administratively for some to follow through with, versus on a course basis, the X percentage of your curriculum. I do like the latitude and option of it, but I just think about the difficulty in tracking. We already have difficulty just tracking attendance normally with professors and students. So I think tracking in on-site as well as distance learning, synchronous or asynchronous, would be difficult, but it's possible.
So that's a good point, Jay. If we were to go in this direction for fixed facility programs to bring clarification to whether the student is attending synchronously, if the class is offered synchronously, they have to be present, they have to be there, albeit remotely, as many of them are now, or whether it's, as you suggested, an opportunity to attend asynchronously. And so that's in clarification. Other thoughts on this?
I wonder how much you can loosen a rule that's in the rules with the guideline. It sounds like this may be at least pushing the envelope.
Yeah, it's a great, so the thing that I based it on, Paul, is actually the rule itself. So I don't know, sorry, I was just trying to scroll. If you look at the actual rule right above that, it says that a JD program, the 80 semester units may be satisfied through a combination of any of the following. And so it doesn't actually indicate that there needs to be 100% in one or 100% in the other. So it seems to me that what this does is create some clarity that in a fixed facility program that there is the opportunity for a certain percentage to be combined. Right now, the major change rule is what people are using to expand beyond their fixed facility, 100% in person on campus. Obviously, we're relying on the CBE's exception to that right now. So this would allow individual students some latitude, and the schools wouldn't have to come to the CBE if individual students needed that latitude up to a particular limit.
Okay, Ashley, can you scroll to the next page there? Oh, okay. So right now, Natalie, am I missing it? But it doesn't really set a limit, the rule, on the amount of participation that could be well, not in person. Or am I reading that wrong?
Oh, there you go. The word of the year, mute. Yeah, so that's correct. So there's not a specific limit. The idea is that JD programs in whole are approved, and then under the major change section, there's a threshold at which the schools would need to come back. I do think that Dean Gardina has raised a question that is on every fixed facility school's mind right now. And just for context, I know we've discussed that in April, based on, in part, on some of the comment that was taken here at a recent CSBARS meeting. The committee will be considering whether in the short term to extend the waiver while schools manage the current situation and decide what they may want to do going forward. Several schools have indicated that they wish to return to the format they had. Several others indicate that they believe that their program may be changed forever, and they may be making requests around that. And so having some clarity around it might be helpful. I do think that flexibility is intended in here, but flexibility with notice to the committee or the jointly accrediting authority.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I think what I was trying to accomplish here is for those schools that want to maintain their fixed facility, they want their policies to be on campus, they want it to be as it was when appropriate, that it does provide some flexibility where a student doesn't have to be absent if they're ill, or they don't have to be absent if they have a family member who's ill. Or if they have an ADA need around an immune system that is compromised. It gives the program a little bit of flexibility to provide the students that up to a certain amount you can attend remotely. So it's not mandated for those schools, but gives them the option to provide students that flexibility when needed. And they can create a policy that works for them, but the guideline would provide that leeway. So that was my thinking. Again, conversation starter, because I know, as Natalie said, it's on people's minds.
One thing that I was thinking about as we're going through this, and it seems like there's not a set threshold in the Cal Accredited rules on guidelines of what would separate fixed facility and distance learning, though I think everyone would recognize here that a lot of that should be defined, especially in terms of when the school is creating its program, what is it creating and designing it for? Online law school program should be designed to be conducted online, and a fixed facility program should be designed to be conducted in person. I think something that comes to mind though is even for fixed facility law schools, let's say if they have take-home exams, right? Just as a scenario, that's something where I don't believe these current guidelines would prohibit that, nor would it be something that would even require a special policy that, permits exceptions. So it seems like with fixed facility, and of course I can be corrected here, there's already some scenarios that naturally exist academically that's asynchronous. It just might not be part of the design of every class, but there's certainly freedom to design that way. Is that correct? What I'm asking is, do the current, do these proposed rules and guidelines as well, even if a school is fixed facility and it's designed to have in-person instruction, there's no prohibition against something like a asynchronous academic activity, like a take-home exam, right?
Not specifically. To analogize to the unaccredited world, if there were to be a take-home exam, it would be outside the 270-hour requirement.
Right.
It's something that could be offered that would be in addition to the program and wouldn't be the main focus of the program. We actually haven't seen very many instances of that because of the need to have the graded class in a an exam simulation type situation, but it could be offered outside the minimum.
Mm-hmm. And that has to do with interactivity, right? Like being in the 270 or not, rather than synchronous or, yeah. Okay. So I think this is a great conversation starter. I think perhaps a way to continue to think about it is, at what point is a school that has a program designed for in-person instruction, what should be the thresholds that they're notifying the committee that they've reached a certain percentage of, having asynchronicity, I guess, and that what should be designed to be an in-person program. I definitely think that there's some natural room that should exist. I mean, just when I think about fixed facility law school programs everywhere, right? If professors have done take-home exams before, I don't think people are going to argue that you can't have some asynchronous academic activity in your in-person program. But maybe just my concern would be, where to set that threshold. Obviously not overly restrictive, but at some point, I think you would want to hold law schools accountable for, what are you really delivering that program for? Is it meant to be conducted online versus it's meant to be conducted in person? And perhaps that can start to be a context or framework to start thinking about thresholds. At what point is it too much and you really want the law school to be saying instead, actually, we're really wanting to have a law school program that's designed for more.
And Jessica, I think you're raising a great point, and I think it actually came up last time we met as well, and it showed up in the minutes, kind of that how do we define ourselves, or what kind of program do each of us offer, and it was kind of a head scratcher in terms of how we would define ourselves. I think it's important, though, to make a distinction or not assume that all distance technology equals asynchronous. You could have remote participation in a synchronous class, or you could have asynchronous components built into a program. So I think it's important to recognize that you could have an in-person component that's remote, as many of us are in the fixed facility context, versus an asynchronous program, which many of the online programs are. So just to make that distinction. So just for point of reference, WASC, it's a 50% mark. As soon as you go above 50% in your what is deemed to be an in-person program, you have to seek a substantive change from WASC in order to have that program be identified as actually distance education, even if it's blended at 5149. So whether or not there's a similar kind of cap to be considered as we move forward in the post-pandemic world for fixed facility CALs, and maybe it'll become a non-issue, but wanted to put it out there as something that is I think needing clarification for all of us as we think about what our programs look like in the future. And so welcome additional conversation and context, especially from those deans that are listening right now who do have fixed facility programs about what might work for them. And so we can certainly think about this as we craft the guidelines, and of course, welcome any comment from the CBE members and State Bar staff about concerns that they have or ideas that they have about how we might fix something, create something that's workable.
And to address Dean Park's question and concern about preserving the structural integrity of a program, it'll be, I believe, somewhat grounded in two pieces of the rule set. The first one being the learning objectives. What is each course trying to do? And the second one being the verified academic engagement. What will be the standards for an in-person course? What will be the standards for an online course or a particular learning objective, so that each student taking a similar type of course will have a similar level of time invested and also a learning outcome.
Thank you, Natalie. Okay, are the COAF members here?
They have just arrived, and we are actually, some have been also observing, and we're going to see if we can promote them. I'm promoting Program Manager Elizabeth Hom from our Office of Access and Inclusion. And
Jackie,
also, oh, sorry.
Jackie.
Judge Kristen. Judge Kristen Rosie and Ms. Sarah Good.
Wonderful, welcome.
Make a comment before we move on to the next topic.
Yes, and welcome to the COAF members. Thank you so much for being present. We're just going to tie up the last conversation we were having and then move forward with our diversity, equity, and inclusion section of our rules. So thank you so much for joining us. And Ashley, if you want to take down this portion right now so that we can see everyone better, and then we can start our conversation face to face. So Greg, you wanted to make a comment about what we were just discussing.
Yes, we all recognize how the world seems to be changing with the effects of COVID and the move to distance communication in all sorts of formats, including this one, and how it can be very effective in many contexts. And I frankly think many of the committee meetings I participate in by Zoom have been actually more effective and efficient than the old in-person meetings. But having said that, there are circumstances where in-person meetings and activities really bring an extra dimension. And then this may be stating the obvious, but for example, I do a lot of mediations, and there's no question in my mind that in-person mediations are much more effective in achieving resolutions. And certainly there are educational contexts where in-person meetings are very, very valuable. You know, on the bar exam side, we don't test clinically. We just basically test doctrine and legal reasoning through the instruments that are now employed. But I am one of those who would argue that legal education as a whole should not move toward ever greater distance learning. It has its place, and there are trade-offs. Certainly there are people who would not be able to be admitted to the bar and become lawyers without having an opportunity to go through distance learning. So I'm not arguing against that. I'm just saying that as a general proposition, we really lose something added when we don't have in-person meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. All right. So, and we will return to that conversation in April, I'm sure, and hopefully others will be able to provide some insights and comments. And now we have the opportunity to move to the portion of the rules that are actually completely new, which is the portions that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion in our law schools. So as many of us discussed during the creation of these rules, these were embedded in our mission. They're certainly part of how we act, but these rules now make it explicit. And while there are only 3 provisions under 4.160C, we did get some proposed guidelines related to kind of clarifying what exactly we would need to bring forth to show to the State Bar that these are efforts that we're making, policies that we have placed, measurements that we're taking. So I wanted to first ask the members of COAF whether they had the opportunity to look at the proposed rules and the proposed guidelines and see if they had any questions or comments related to that.
And Dean Gardina, before we do so, maybe it would be helpful to have Elizabeth introduce our team, especially because we have a new visitor for the first time. Is good.
My apologies. I jumped in before that. Elizabeth, if you would take a moment to do that, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. Thank you, Dean Gardina, and thank you, Natalie. And thank you, CSBARS, for inviting the Office of Access and Inclusion and the Council on Access and Fairness to participate in this discussion. As you know, diversity, equity, inclusion is very near and dear to our hearts, and we are very pleased that CSBARS has made the intentional decision to include DEI in the accreditation rules. And so with me today, we have Judge Kristen Rossi, who is one of our COAF members who also participated in providing some feedback on the rules revision. And then we also have one of our newer COAF members, Sarah Good, who we've got caught up to speed and knows where we are in this discussion. And we're really just very excited to continue this discussion, today and beyond. So again, thank you again for the invitation to join you.
All right, thank you, and welcome to both of you. So apologies that I jumped right over the niceties of an introduction. Returning to the question, hopefully, did you have a chance to look at both the rules and the proposed guidelines before you joined us today?
Yeah, we did. And Sarah has done a deep dive and got herself caught up on all of the work that we had done in the year prior to her joining COAF. So I think we're up to speed, and she definitely got a little bit of the history from the last time we all met, which I guess was a year ago, maybe pretty close to that. So
yeah.
So thank you for having us back.
Absolutely. And any questions about what you have seen?
And Dean Gardina, would you like us to place those guidelines up on the screen?
And we can absolutely move in that direction. I just want to make sure, even though I skipped over the introductions, I wanted everyone to be able to see them at least. So now that we've done the introductions, we can put the guidelines up on the screen. And then just wanted to first make sure there weren't any questions about what you see written, and then we'll ask the committee members if there are any insights that they want to glean from you as we move forward with the guideline proposals. So Ashley, it is 4.160C.
Okay, and just to be clear, is that in the Word document again?
It is, yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm sharing the correct thing. Okay. I might have scrolled down a little bit too much.
There you go, right there. So we have 3 proposed guidelines that are all pretty much related to the same concept, which is what exactly is it that we would need to maintain, publish, present to the State Bar, data, et cetera. And so just wanted to check with the COAF members whether any of these proposed guidelines kind of hit the mark in a way that is meaningful for the work that you are trying to do.
And before we get there, can we just confirm, is the print large enough for everyone to be comfortable?
It is for me.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Dean Gardenia, can you ask the question again?
Sure.
I'm looking at it.
I'm sorry, under C, there's actually 3 proposed guidelines, all of them dealing with the same concept, just trying to figure out what exactly we would need to present to the state bar as part of our accreditation metrics. And also, quite honestly, what's going to help COAF do the work that you're trying to do in terms of diversifying the legal profession here in California and partnering with others. So is there one particular proposed guideline that for you kind of hits the mark?
And Dean Gardina, I have to admit, I don't think Judge Rossi and Sarah have seen these the language in these proposed guidelines. So we might need a moment just for them to get up to speed.
Got it. Okay.
I think we saw the first part, the bolded, but I don't think we saw the proposed guidelines.
Okay, my apologies.
That's okay. So it looks like the first, at least the first guideline seems to, the first part seems to mirror what we talked about and I guess what was adopted last year. At least that first part about the California law and mission appropriate language is, it sounds like what we adopted last year.
Mm-hmm.
And for those that helped to draft this, to the extent that you'd like to present them to the team, that would probably be very helpful.
And if I may jump in on the second proposed guideline, data is very important to, evaluating and understanding, and even just setting the baseline of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives within an organization, whether it be a law school or a law firm. And so I think, COAF would be very supportive of ensuring that there are metrics that are consistent with within across the law schools, so that we can really get a good picture of who the law students are, so that we can understand, whether the matriculation rates are to study those and to understand, the attrition and retention across schools in California. And I know that there's been a lot of work with the annual report to kind of standardize and provide enhanced data reporting. And so we're working very closely with Natalie and others in the Office of Admissions to take a look at that, the first look at that enhanced reporting to hopefully better understand the picture of California law students. So I think that second proposed guideline is something that COAF would be in favor of.
And Jay,
I did have a question about the second proposed guideline, which identifies certain categories, and they seem to mirror EEOC categories. And I would note that the EEOC this year is starting to track gender a little bit differently, not just male and female, but also non-binary. But I did notice the distinct absence of a category for LGBTQIA self-identified folks. And obviously that is a group of people who the state bar is tracking and is actively interested in tracking from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint. Now, I understand that certain of the law schools involved here may discriminate against LGBTQ folks in terms of admissions and it being in the student population. And so that's why this phrased as sort of mission appropriate, but I wondered why that category of folks was just excluded wholesale from the proposed guidelines, recognizing that in certain schools, perhaps that demographic won't be tracked, but in other schools, I would very much hope that it would be, since members of the LGBTQIA community are heavily discriminated against throughout our society and throughout history, and is certainly a group that we want to track. So I did have a question there.
Thank you. And Jay, I know that you took the laboring oar on this, so.
Dean Gardina, before that, may I interject?
Sure.
Sure. Okay, so the source of these is the ABA guidelines, and actually separate and apart from this, the State Bar is planning to do a 3-year rollout. And in this first year, the demographic categories were synchronized with the ABA. In the coming year, the gender categories will be expanded, and then subsequent, an LGBT category as well as a veteran or disability status are being considered as well. And we would like to continue to work with Access and Inclusion, to work with the schools and have a successful rollout. And I'll tell you that this year, when the demographic categories were rolled out, people did not know how the changes would be taken, and there was no negative feedback of any kind. And in fact, the only feedback we received was, would you consider more categories, gender being the most frequently identified? So I think that they're finding that as they implement these, the students are ready, just as the State Bar is ready to be collecting this information.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thank you, Natalie. And actually, there's actually a third proposed guideline as well. But Jay, you took the laboring oar on these proposed guidelines. Do you want to speak?
Sure, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for attending, and your comments are definitely helpful. All of these, there's no pride of authorship from any one of us or any one committee. I am always a firm believer of the hive mind. The more minds we have looking at documents, the better that document will become. When we were drafting this, I was looking really through 3 different lenses. First lens, I really enjoyed the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi, for those that have read that. And I think it's a great model to think about, where it's not enough not to be racist, but what are you doing proactively? And I think that's what we're trying to carry over in these guidelines. Not that we prohibit racism, sexism, discrimination, because that should already exist, but what are we doing proactively to prevent it? Going forward to better our society, to better our communities, and to more integrate all of our communities. So that was one lens. The other lens was, as I'm an administrator of a law school, so going through how could we document this without increasing our cost to our shareholders, to our students? Because every category, every additional rule will have in essence, a tax on a student, right? To increase the tuition ultimately as we're gathering and going through data. And that's why, at least on that proposed guideline, we are focused on what's called IPEDS data. Most institutions already report to IPEDS. So we're listing only the categories that IPEDS currently listed, because they're already reported. So therefore, it wouldn't put an additional burden on any institution to report data they already are reporting. And then we can focus on changing what IPEDS collects and then expanding in that category and do more of a national change too, I think, at that time. But of course, there's nothing that prevents us from changing what we're going to do internally. Again, I think every institution here has higher ambitions than to meet accreditation guidelines. And this should be that low watermark. Okay, what should every school that wants to play in our field have to do? And we thought that would be the minimum. Also, I was looking through the lens. I've been on a couple site visit teams for the State Bar and for WASC, going, how could I figure this out? How could I tell if someone's in compliance or not in compliance? Because some of these are very gray areas, where we can see, and I think we see this a lot in law enforcement, where there's policies and procedures, but sometimes the way they're implemented is still having a detrimental impact on communities. So we try to figure out what is more objective, what is measurable, what is quantifiable. And I think, as Elizabeth was saying, when we can count, I always believe we count what counts to us, what's important to us. And I think if we start counting and looking at these numbers, this would give site visit teams a conversation then. Okay, well, you notice that there are certain underrepresented communities in your institution, and they're not performing at the same level as the average individual of your institution. Have you inquired why? And that's why there's the requirement of a memo. So it doesn't require that there's a guarantee that there'll be equality, because I'm not sure how that could ever occur, but there should be a quality improvement, I would hope, with each cycle, each year, each inspection cycle. What are you doing to make your institution better? And we're just trying to institutionalize that now at the State Bar accreditation level. So those are the 3 lenses. And it's me being more of a minimalist too. You know, what could I make the most functional that would have the least pushback? What schools should already be doing that we can now document and track. And I think it's excellent that, especially what Natalie's been doing so far, about incorporating this even before these rules and guidelines come out now in the annual report. So we can already start gathering the status for implementation. I can answer any questions if it would be helpful at all, of course.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't see Sarah anymore in my group of people, so I can't tell if she was going to say something. But I want to say, and I understand what you're saying, Jay, about how you got to where you got, and what's in there. And I completely understand what you're saying about, not wanting to tax the students more, and trying to collect all the data. My only fear, and it echoes what Sarah said, my only fear is that if there's an invisibility in the guidelines for, the LGBTQ plus group, then that invisibility every year gets compounded on. And so if we don't start tracking it now, and we're saying to ourselves, we're going to start tracking it later, I think we miss an opportunity at this juncture when we're starting to track everything and we're starting to look at metrics, and we're starting to, and of course this takes a long time and this isn't an overnight process by any stretch. But when you're starting to try and be more inclusive and talk about cultural competency across the board, I think if we leave out LGBTQ plus folks now, then we're starting with a handicap when we finally do include them. And it seems to be easier to me if we just, start looking at those kinds of things from the get-go when we're starting to do everything else. And I understand what you're saying and why you went the way you went. I'm just sort of saying why I think it makes more sense to do it in the beginning than later.
Yeah, and this is Sarah. Judge Rosie, that was a little more eloquent than I was, so thank you, about visibility. I also worry that for others looking at these guidelines and not seeing themselves there is a problem. So for an LGBTQ potential student, looking at what's being tracked and not feeling welcomed, and in fact, feeling the opposite of included, feeling excluded. And the same would be true, I think, for persons who self-identify as having a disability. For veteran status would be another category. And so I guess I think trying to be as inclusive as possible in the first instance should be the goal, rather than feeling that this group or that group will get added on at some point in the future. It doesn't feel good.
And if I may ask, would it be possible to add the categories that are proposed for the annual report in this proposed guideline instead of the IPEDS data?
I definitely think we could do that. I believe this drafting predates that.
Okay.
And so and that's why, again, on my side for drafting, I was just looking, what is an outside entity we could designate, and then they could follow along with whatever changes occur and what we should track and when we should track it. So I don't think we'd have a problem if we did the same thing for the committee bar examiners. So if we use the committee bar examiners designated categories and frequency of gathering data, I think that would still get the same purpose I'm attempting to achieve here.
And Ashley, can you take the document down so we can see each other during this conversation, since they've had a chance to review what's there? Thank you. Perfect. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for that, Ashley. Other questions or from committee members about what we're trying to accomplish here and for co-op members in particular?
I don't think that, I don't know that I have any other questions. I think that, we're eager to see what kind of things you all are going to come up with, what kind of programs and ways of tracking the data that you all are going to come up with. And so, we're really looking forward to that kind of, to the rollout and to see how it goes.
Well, wonderful. I have a particular question, which is the website for your committee is ambitious, and which is wonderful. But what you've set out is, I mean, we're talking pipeline from kindergarten through the legal profession, which is we have a tiny slice of that. So one of the things that it says on the website is the partner, collaborate, and coordinate to achieve diversity with existing entities. So I have a question as someone always looking as ways to bring resources into the school for the students. Have you guys identified ways that you're going to partner, programs that you're going to put on, or other things that you might be able to do to provide resources for our schools and our students?
If I may answer that.
She was dying to answer first before us.
So COAF, we've been, Access and Inclusion staff have been working with COAF, and we surveyed the law schools. And so thank you to all of you who were able to participate in that survey, which I know coincided with the annual report and was quite a lengthy survey. But we have been able to get some really great data about the support services that you provide to your students, particularly diverse students. So our plan is to review all of that data along with the data from this first enhanced version of the annual report, as well as with the ABA 509 data, and to try to create a picture of California law students and the resources available to them, and issue a report on that later this year. So I think that will be one key document that COAF will be able to provide, and we hope to either be able to preview or present this report to this group and to others that maybe Natalie can help us identify. To be a resource both to the law schools and I think ultimately to the law students. So that is one of our big projects for this year. And then COAF doesn't actually engage in a lot of kind of individual programming, where we are trying to the work that COAF's doing is really in line with what the state bar's strategic plan is, and more policy driven. And so for law schools, that is what we're concentrating on. We're also working with the Office of Admissions on various initiatives looking at the bar exam, including the strategies and stories program, including the question development and grading analysis. And so we're really excited to be able to partner with so many of our colleagues across the bar and with the volunteers in the different sub-entities to be able to further diversity, equity, and inclusion for the profession.
Wonderful. And so just, I noticed that you guys have a really nice kind of digital brochure, and it identifies attorneys in California of color or non-binary or identify as LGBTQIA. Just a little question there. They're all ABA graduates. Would you consider featuring a Cal or registered school graduate in that category who is also doing wonderful things in the profession here in California?
I think the answer is yes to that. I think we probably won't be able to update that brochure in the near term, but I think for our next iteration, we would definitely want to do that. Because I think that's an important, very important path to the profession to highlight.
Let me just speak to that super quickly as well, because I was on the group that redid the brochure. We actually reached out to several people who went to registered and accredited schools, and we didn't get back. We didn't hear back from those folks to profile them in time, but we did reach out to some folks, and we're also hoping to try and do more of a digital presence in addition to the printed brochure. So it may also be possible that we can feature more people in the, sorry, Amazon delivery, more people, feature more people on the website than are actually included in the printed brochure. So that's also a possibility that we can look into. And certainly if you have, folks that you think it would be helpful for us to profile, we would be happy to do that. And that brochure was sort of a long overdue for a redo. So it happened during the pandemic. So again, more amazing things done by the State Bar staff during the pandemic.
Yeah. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think one of the things that makes California so unique is the multiple pathways into the profession and the diversity of educational opportunities in order to get there. And I have no doubt that there are people right now in our attending who are already making a list of potential graduates who would be wonderful to feature. So I think reaching out to any one of the deans and saying, who among your graduates would be a good representation, I think you'll probably get flooded with potential responses. So thank you for that. And then just out of curiosity, again, from the website, careful what you post there. You said that you're going to create mechanisms to kind of measure change. How do the law schools and then fit in with that kind of measuring change piece that you're thinking about?
I think that really has to do with, creating the baseline of data, looking at the enhanced reporting, and I'm really hoping that this resource and report that we publish later this year will be able to, provide a benchmark for us to look at who California law students are, what supports they're receiving, maybe how we can better support law students so that they're, getting through the law school process, studying successfully for the bar exam, and then entering the profession, and then staying in the profession, right? So I think it will be a very long-term measurement, because change is very incremental. If anybody's been paying attention to the attorney census and the diversity report card, from year to year, it's a very small change, 0.3% to that end, right? So I think it's working with all of you to collect the data, to look at what your programming is and what the initiatives are, to promote and prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then, maybe perhaps at some point surveying law students again, to get a sense of what their feelings of belonging as students are on the campus. And so I think it's going to be multi-year, multi-prong approach to determining how we're measuring.
Okay, all right, thank you. I have other questions, but I don't want to dominate more than I am. So did other members, did anything get thoughts that came up that you want to make sure that we cover while we have the committee members here?
I just wanted to comment very quickly. I think it's thank you so much for coming, and especially to see that expansive vision of what we're doing for diversity, access, and inclusion. It's great to see, and it's great to think about how we can serve a stage in that. I just wanted to echo with Jay, just that a lot of the just looking at the task of potentially having a guideline under this rule set. That's a very narrow task, even to see if we need that guideline. And the positive purpose of that would be that it helps law schools understand what they need to do to be meeting that guideline, especially in a compliance site visit setting. What I'm gathering from this, and I think it's very exciting, is that there's still more information to understand and explore, especially to standardize expectations a certain way. What the education community has available is, like what Jay said, iPads, but they're coming, from a different set of mission and context, obviously. So I look very much forward to, what the future report would be later this year. I really hope that if this group is syncing with that wider work that's being done, that we can know about the timing of that kind of data and reports, because that will help us make sure that we're really writing a clarifying guideline that's in sync, that helps the law schools understand how they can be part of the process but in that incremental way. And I think I would just ask in terms of thinking about what would be the inputs from the deans. I think everyone is excited for the work that would be done, and we can see how it will be that multi-year project. But they're going to be coming from, a variety of student body sizes or sort of resources for survey systems or student information systems. So for CSBARS this year, if we can get that information and try to stay incrementally in sync, I think that would be the most positive thing. And I hope that what was drafted here just presents a good picture of where we're starting from. But I hope with more information, we can, if there are other benchmarks besides what we're getting from other contexts to sync to, I hope that we can get that from your group.
Thank you, Dean Park. I think one other thing that Sarah and Judge Rossi and I had talked about with Natalie is, this is a very exciting time for the law school community to be innovative and to try various initiatives to see how they work with their specific student communities, and then to evaluate, and then, if there can be improvements or things tweaked or changed to have a best practice type program, then I think this is the opportunity to do that, because it is not one size fits all, especially because many of the schools serve very specific communities, and so I think that's why co-op is just so excited to be engaged in this process, because there is so much opportunity and so much progress that can be made.
Great. No, I'm excited to hear that, and I'm very glad that we can have you engaged in early.
Dean Frickberg?
Sure, just wanted to say thank you again for your comments, your thoughts. Unfortunately, what it comes out in our guideline and rule is not as rich as the discussion we've had in our meetings, and especially the discussions we have internally at our own institutions. I think you'll find a very kindred spirit among most of us, that we're drawn to education as a calling because we want to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that's part of the educational process, helping everyone. Rising tide raises all boats, and I think that is a deeply committed spirit for all of us. One of the issues that came out that is an interesting one, you might have a way of helping us resolve it, as we were adding more categories. One of the concerns, some of our institutions are very small, maybe 40, 60 students in total. There was a concern, is that going to potentially force someone to declare who they are when they don't feel comfortable doing it? Because then they might be identified as a category of one, as an example. We were able to work around some of those issues with Natalie helping to guide us, in that we were submitting data to the bar and then having it aggregated.
Yeah.
But we couldn't use it institutionally, because then students, administrators, faculty might be able to identify that one person in that one category, and that might be uncomfortable for that individual, and then make them not declare they're in that category. So I don't know if there's any thoughts or comments in that area, because that's an area we've gone a couple of times with issues on.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think that we have discussed that there are these privacy concerns, and we would defer to the schools and to Natalie, having worked with all of the schools on these specific issues, for the students to report what they're comfortable reporting. I think that's probably the top priority. We are not. We do not want to force anybody to disclose anything or report anything that they're not comfortable with, but we are sensitive to these privacy issues, and would work with Natalie and the schools to figure out what would be the best way to convey this information, whether it's aggregate or in some other way.
Oops. There is also a decline to state in what we collect. And the hope is that even for the students that choose to use that now, as the data starts to come back, as the data is used, as the data creates change, that hopefully people who might have at one point selected that decline to state may also feel comfortable enough to identify. So we hope that even for those that might need a little bit more time, that we're creating an inclusive and inviting and welcoming path to consider making a change.
I'd like to say a few words. I just want to applaud all of you for this entire effort. I think it's a fabulous goal that you have, and I'm hoping that we can achieve it overall. I'm wondering if at some point we can receive something in the way of examples that would help us when it comes to us putting together policies and practices that will help us achieve the goals that you have in this regard. Something that Dean Frickbird said a while ago struck me, and that was that during inspections for WASC, one of the problems is trying to determine compliance from non-compliance. So when our schools are inspected with reference to what we're doing regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion, what will be focused on for purposes of determining whether our schools are complying or not complying in this overall effort? Secondly, I'm wondering if there's something in the way of wording that can be put into the rules and the guidelines that will provide examples so that the schools will know the types of things that can be done. Again, thank you.
Thank you,
And
Dean.
one way that we're thinking about that is in the annual report that precedes the implementation of these plans, having the schools to begin to give a sketch of what they are thinking about so that we can start a dialogue and perhaps continue the dialogue with access and inclusion as well, so that we can make sure that folks are comfortable that they're setting off on the right path. You may bring additional ideas to the State Bar. State Bar may have additional ideas to you as well, and you can move forward efficiently and hopefully very effectively.
And Natalie, the Elizabeth and Sarah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought during our discussion that we talked about the fact that there were some resources out there for these schools to take a look at, that, you know, things that the State Bar might already have that they could take a look at. But beyond that, and I want to sort of reiterate something that we said before, and that is that we understand that you know your schools better than we do. And we certainly don't profess to know them as well as you do. So how it gets measured and how you sort of do the tracking, you know, or I don't think that COAF is trying to micromanage that in any way. I think what we would say is that we would encourage you to look at the resources that are out there, but also to try something new. And maybe even to try a new way of doing something and having it fail. Because I think that there's actually a lot to be learned in trying something innovative and saying, well, we did that for a couple of years and it was a disaster, but now we know it doesn't work for our student body, and so we can do something different. And certainly you all are all, you know, talking together, and there are some commonalities between your schools so that you all can sort of talk and say, this worked for us and this might work for you. So, you know, really when it comes down to it, there are examples out there, but we also want you to, you know, the group to feel empowered enough to do things that would work for their communities and their school community that we just don't know about already, because this isn't our area of expertise.
Yeah,
And
I'll just add on to that point, which is, you know, to Kristen's point, you all know your schools. They have you come from very specific geographic regions in California. You know, and to Elizabeth's point, there's no one size fits all. You know, unfortunately, we can't say, you know, adopt these 10 policies and then you're compliant, right? It all has to be kind of mission specific to your particular organizations. And I think what's kind of exciting is there are plenty of roadmaps out there for ABA accredited schools and other kinds of organizations that you can look at. Not that, you know, we're adopting that any one of them is sort of the one that you should mimic, but, you know, there's a lot of resources at, for example, the ABA, the California Minority Council Program, the Law School Legal Diversity Program. NALP has a special diversity, equity, and inclusion group with a lot of resources. I've also noticed the Association of American Law Schools has a Law Dean's Anti-Racist Clearinghouse project that has resources. The Law School Admissions Council has some resources. There's a lot of, and the ABA itself has like a diversity and inclusion center that then will focus specifically on women's sexual orientation, gender identity, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of things that you can kind of take a look at, but I think what's really exciting here and innovative is there is no template for your school in particular, right, out there. And so I think you're free to kind of cut and paste and come up with something that really works for your schools and your environment and be really innovative and experimental about it. So I think that's really exciting. I'm really interested in seeing what you all come up with. And, you know, it may be that you'll be creating a template for similar schools in other states to kind of copy the kinds of things that you're implementing and creating your own best practices, which I think would be really exciting. So thank you. And also thank you for inviting us to come. I really appreciate seeing all of you and seeing how engaged and thoughtful you are in this process. It's really, you know, really very heartening. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just really appreciate the partnership as we move this project forward. And just want to end, I know one of the things that you guys also want to do, which seems ambitious, which is to produce institutional and attitudinal change. And one of the things as we start doing this work internally at my institution, we were talking about dominant culture expectations versus non-dominant culture expectation. And as I looked at the list of dominant culture expectations, it very much mirrored the legal profession. And we build our institutional expectations around what they're going to have to do when they enter the legal profession. And so really needing to think about that kind of legal culture being built by, you know, the dominant members of our society. And so there is an enormous amount of work to be done around that legal culture, because I'm imagining even if they successfully exit our institutions and enter the legal profession, that legal culture is also going to cause a continued exit from the profession as a result of all of that. So again, hopefully we'll be able to do our part, and those who graduate can be part of that eventual change in the law culture as well. But obviously it's a long-term project. So look forward to continuing to work with you, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Okay.
And Elizabeth, I look forward to following up with you on the topics and opportunities that were discussed today.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I will be returning Elizabeth, Sarah, and Kristen to the audience.
Thank you. And so wanted to bring us back to that admissions question, because to me, it ties in with that diversity, equity, inclusion work we're doing, and be very interested to hear people's thoughts about the choices that we make in terms of opening our doors up wide to give as many people as possible an opportunity to enter the legal profession, knowing that some of them may be unsuccessful in that first year, and that certainly, or beyond, or unsuccessful in the bar exam. And there is, for me, that inherent tension in the work that we do around opportunity, inclusion, and equity, and kind of metrics regarding retention or graduation or even bar pass rates. And just interested to hear from other deans about this DEI work that we all want to do and get better at, and that tension inherent in the work that we do.
I mean, there's no easy answers, right? If we, if we had the answers, we'd be, geniuses, right? I mean, I will say that for me personally, for whatever it's worth, right? And I think I've expressed this at meetings before. I mean, there seems to be a broader trend away from relying primarily on standardized test scores, right? Of course, one of the benefits of relying on standardized test scores is that it's standardized, right? When, two students both have a 3.3 from school A and school B, and you don't know if they're using the same grading scale, the same level of rigor, right? So it becomes much harder when we're talking about, the information that's reasonably available to, a school at the time of a student's admission. And honestly, I think that cost plays a big factor in this, right? Because, the average Cal accredited school is a lot cheaper than the average ABA school, right? And, especially in combination with, we have a rule that says that you have to consider students for probation within no more than a year, right? I think cost plays into that, because the opportunity cost, the risk, right, of someone enrolling in a school for, $10,000 a year, whatever it is, right, is very different than if it's $50,000 a year, $60,000 a year, right? And so, I don't know what that dividing line is, but in terms of what a school is reasonably, willing to, who they're willing to take a risk on in terms of numerical predictors, that ties into the transparency. Does the student understand what they're getting into, what the likelihood is they'll pass the bar exam, what the debt they're going to incur is, and how much will that debt be, right? So, I don't know how to draft a guideline to reflect that, but, perhaps something along the lines of, in determining what information is reasonably available to a school, among those things could be the costs a student might incur in enrolling, the questions about the validity of standardized testing, et cetera. I don't know. I mean, generally, I'm not in favor of guidelines that are just sort of, they don't give you some more concrete benchmarks. They're just more sort of hortatory. But in this case, I think that might be valuable. I don't know.
We've also at times talked about another concept, making sure that you've got the program that is right for the students that you accept.
Right,
and so a certain school might be able to have choose to have the resources for a particular population to bring them to a successful conclusion to their education and licensure, and others may go a different way. So also being clear about what the school can provide and making sure that you are iterating and investing to provide the resources that your students need to succeed. And so we've talked with schools that have more students that have a public interest focus, that may be English language learners, that may be working parents, and having special resources at those schools to help the particular populations. And so it's possible that what's right, the correct admissions policy for one school may not be for another, but making sure that you've got that dialogue. Who are you accepting? How are you explaining it to them? And what are you doing to make sure they're successful in evaluating your plan? Some element of that cycle is important.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Other thoughts?
I have one. I think it gets a bit more confusing when you're talking about retention versus recruitment. What do you do for retention purposes in the way of making changes that would accommodate certain groups? You can't do that for one group and not for everyone. So when it comes to retention, I scratch my head thinking about possibilities for purposes of helping out people who are challenged at a point in time when they may end up having to leave the program. So I'm looking for ideas from others. Any that can be offered will certainly be welcome. And I'm hoping that there are good ideas that can help us with both recruitment and retention. But it's the retention part of it that I find just a bit more confusing.
I would agree with Dean Clancy that I think a lot of what this discussion circulates around, there's two pieces to it. I think looking at some of what the older rules and guidelines have focused on, I think everyone among the law school community understands the importance of consumer protection and transparency, and counseling a student that's coming new to the school about what the school has, what kind of program it has for them, and making sure that that's as accurate as it can be to them, because that's the point the student's choosing to come into the program or not. I think what's a little bit harder to make into a guideline for the specific admissions section is I feel this in a similar way actually with the diversity, equity, and inclusion. Not to say that I'm completely at a loss, but if we're not going to have a guideline in these areas, the default expectation is that the law school can be figuring out from the rule. There's not some sort of standardized way or to point the law school to. And for admissions, I feel like what's being asked for perhaps is maybe something about how you handle evaluation in your admissions decisions. But again, I'm not sure how to get that into a guideline that would be, working across the law schools. I feel if it's going to be something that's more about the admit has sufficient, accurate, and comprehensive information for what they're deciding to get into, that to me is pushed into consumer protection and transparency, because it's also, I think, what we're used to looking at for that kind of goal and purpose. I think for the admission piece, if we're going to add something there that's different, I think that gets into what are we asking or what are we telling law schools, as a measure of compliance related to evaluating. Like, is there a certain way to evaluate that will work or not? And I know already that there is a diversity among the law schools and how they do that. So I can't right now come up with that language easily. So, but it sounds like if we're going to add something there, that's what we would want to clarify for the purpose of helping law schools understand how to comply with that section.
And so it sounds like what I'm hearing multiple people say is some of this is in the consumer protection and transparency section in terms of the information provided to prospective students, both about the programs, the schools, the costs, et cetera, but also what we might be seeing in their packet that we know based on our own analysis might indicate that they could struggle in the law program. And that we're communicating to that to them meaningfully. I think most of us probably do that as part of the admissions process anyway. So that's helpful that people are seeing it in the consumer protection and transparency. There is absolutely zero obligation that we create a guideline if we don't think that it's necessary or helpful. It was just a query that someone had made. And Greg, you wanted to make a comment.
Well, just in the regulatory format, which is a milieu, which is where I understand we're located, it's very difficult to enforce any kind of regulations unless you have something which you can measure, and that's just the reality. And the problem is in this area, it's very difficult to measure effectively and to have it, at least with respect to some of it, or have, and particularly in with the cohort we're talking about, where schools have mission specific goals that may differ from the general population. So I think it's largely to be an exhortation, and you rely on the good faith of schools and the general cultural milieu to break through to achieve the kind of goals you want to reach. But I don't see a regulatory format as a really good place to deal with this, because unless you have measurable standards, you can't enforce them effectively.
Thank you, Greg. That's very helpful. Okay. Yeah, Jay.
Well, I would share that I think a conflict on this and just the thinking of it. When we talk about admissions, I think really we're focusing more on what are the credentials of those being admitted to our schools. And what each institution uses is a different credential. Some of us require LSAT, some require that you take the LSAT, then use that to decide how you're admitted. Others have different admissions criteria. So I think it's very difficult to make an objective, measurable, quantifiable component unless we wanted to focus on attrition. If as an accreditor, they want to say if you go over X percentage attrition, that's going to raise an issue for the next site visit. My thought, if I was writing a guideline for this one, would be just to have a policy created that's mission specific. And I think that's what most of us have already done internally with what our admissions requirements are, but just the existence of a policy versus required output.
Marty, did you want to say something again? No, okay, all right. Well, I really appreciate both the discussion around the DEI issues as well as the one we just had on admissions. And the kind of final guideline that was proposed, well, not the absolute final one, but the one that was proposed in the 4.160A, B, C, and D, was that related to the academic program plan, which was in section D5. And it provided a fairly comprehensive list of things that would need to be included in the academic program plan that I'm assuming, Natalie, is something that the State Bar would imagine being submitted as part of the annual report as it is now.
Correct.
Okay, so the proposed guideline actually contains the word should, so that this would be a mandatory list. And so that's one thing for us to pay attention to, as well as the things that are listed. I'm also curious for people, because we just talked about guidelines related to a DEI plan, including kind of assessment of our students' work and progress, whether there's a blending of some of those things together. But just wanted people to have an opportunity to comment on the academic program plan, whether it should have a should, whether it should be a may, but some are mandatory, some are not, whether the list is a good list, whether things need to be added. So any comments related to that?
Gardenia, would you like me to pull that up?
Would that be helpful for people? Yep.
I think it would.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and put that up? Thank you, Ashley.
So there is one bit of duplication in there between 5 and 8.
One was
I saw that as well. The difference is annual program goals versus long range program goals between the two.
Okay, I see. Yeah, we could truncate that in the final version and just include both.
And I'm forgetting who crafted this originally. Jay, was this you or?
I believe it was Dean.
Jackie, that was, well, Jay crafted it originally. I was the one that added the
Guideline,
the
right.
items that are in red, and I misnumbered them. You'll see that it goes from 5 to 7. So actually 7 should be 6 and following.
All right. So Mike, any thought, do you want to kind of give some context to this, or why you chose these particular ones, what your thinking was?
Well, the task, as I understood it, was that we were to look to see if there were any ambiguities in the wording that exist. And my thought was that something could be provided in the way of guidance to those who have to draft an academic program plan. We've been obligated to do it in the past, as was pointed out a couple minutes ago, in 6.1 of the existing guidelines, there's reference to the obligation to have a written plan. And I had to make one for the very first time just a number of months ago because our school was just accredited. So I sat down to draft it, but I didn't really have any guidance. I didn't know what the topic should be. And I, for that reason, just came up with what I thought should work. I haven't heard any input related to what I submitted, so I'm assuming that it was okay, and I hope so. But I'm thinking that for the future, we should provide something in the way of at least headings for the academic program plan that needs to be submitted in writing by the schools. And I'm thinking that it's going to be an annual requirement, but I don't know that it says that in the new rules. So that's the context.
Thank you, Mike. Comments, questions?
I just have one comment, which is, I mean, I like it. I think it makes sense. I do think we should consider combining current 4 and 7 and current 5 and 8, because, you know, I don't know. I can imagine that a school might not separately break out annual educational goals, but for seeing in a guideline that they have to do that, right? Not that we don't have, you know, things we want to accomplish within a year, but I can say, you know, for my own institution, with my university, we for a number of years have had every employee as part of their, you know, self-evaluation process, talk about what are their annual goals. And now we're actually having a shift more towards, you know, that's a little short-sighted. Let's talk about what can you do to help promote the university's long-term goals and your school's long-term goals, right? So I don't know that we may want to box schools in to having annual educational goals on the one hand and long-range program goals on the other. Obviously, they should have goals and they should be analyzing, do they have the resources necessary to achieve those? But I don't know that we should be so specific. Other than that, I like this.
Thank you. Other comments or thoughts?
I agree with Marty that I think this is a great starting list, but it can be consolidated down the way he described.
Okay, 5 and 8. Jay or Paul or Greg? So a little bit of editing, but a strong start in terms of giving some parameters to what would be most helpful in crafting that annual report, or excuse me, the academic program plan, which normally is submitted as part of the annual report. Okay, all right. We do have some other kind of proposed rules outside of those categories, which is the ones under 4.147, 4.172, and a question under 4.178 that we can certainly return to in April. And I think, Natalie, correct me if I'm wrong, but another kind of, once we get a sense of what the rules are, we can now turn our attention to the annual report to ensure that we're keying whatever the annual report is to those new rules and whatever the guidelines may be.
It would be staff's intention to bring a proposal to the CSBARS for some comment to make sure that we do something that is workable and efficient for the schools. I think it may be easier to have something like that as a start to give that type of comment, because the report can be lengthy. And also I know that there's a clear desire to make sure that it is no more lengthy than necessary on all parts.
Right, and actually you can take this down right now. We're almost Done, thank you. So in April, just a month away, we can complete the cycle. I think we'll have a sense on Friday what's going to be hopefully happening with the rules in terms of the recommendation that the CBE will make to the Board of Trustees for its May meeting. So we'll, I think, have a better sense of a potential timeline regarding the need to finalize the guidelines, allow people to see them and provide comments, as well as additional concepts that may have been missed. Obviously, as people start to implement the new rules, other things may come up that we didn't catch, and that I think is just this is going to be an iterative process as the new rules kind of begin to be implemented by schools across the Cal system. So any other comments or questions before we sign off for today's meeting?
I have a question, and I apologize if this was covered before. Natalie, towards the beginning of the meeting, I think you mentioned that there were 5 public comments that were received regarding the draft rules. Are those posted somewhere collectively that we can see, or is there like a summary of them anywhere?
They'll be part of the discussion tomorrow, on Friday at the committee meeting.
But they won't be posted ahead of time?
They'll be posted when the item is posted, as soon as it is ready.
Okay.
And then also, one thing that I'll ask for folks generally is I'll send a note just to remind everyone after the meeting related to the accreditation and the non-compliance process, the section that hasn't been discussed yet, to encourage you to look at them offline and submit your feedback to staff offline. We think the discussion will be lighter there, but we still want to make sure that we receive your feedback, because we will be beginning to draft. But also in the meantime, it's thought that perhaps the majority of the discussion in April may focus around comments related to the NPR. There may be less time to have further guideline discussions. So I'll encourage that, and also encourage the submission of public comment in between, as we have taken at different times, can be sent directly to me at natalie.leonard@calbar.ca.gov.
Thank you, Natalie. Any other questions or comments before we finish up today? Well, I want to thank everyone for attending. It will be just a month before we see each other again. As Natalie said, comments on the remaining guidelines to her if you can, given that in our April meeting, we'll be focusing a majority of our attention on the NPR discussion. So is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
I'll second.
Great. Is it necessary to do a roll call vote on a motion to adjourn?
No, we have not been doing that as a practice.
Good. Wonderful. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much.
You
Thank you,
just
everyone.
without objection.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Jackie.